And we are ready to go. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's 12:02. Thank you very, very much for everybody for joining us today. This is a really interesting conversation for me, and I'm thanking the two people who were, actually three people who were responsible for getting all this set up. Dr. David himself, Michelle Longmire, and Xuan Gui. I know you're on this call or on this webinar, but you corralled us in a bar at JP Morgan in San Francisco and said we should have this conversation. So it only took us until August to do it from January. So thank you, Xuan. Welcome, everybody. This is a great conversation today. I'd like to just kick it off with introductions. So David, why don't you go first and introduce yourself and what you do and where you are?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Ritesh, for putting this together. And it's really an honor to be on the panel with such distinguished panelists. My name is David Feigenbaum. I'm a physician scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, where I run a center dedicated to studying cytokine storm disorders, so particularly Castleman disease, and more recently, the cytokine storm disorder that many of us have heard about, COVID-19. In addition to being a physician scientist, I was really first introduced to cytokine storms when I became sick with a cytokine storm disorder myself as a medical student. Even had my last rites read to me back in 2010 when the doctors didn't think I would survive. I certainly survived and unfortunately went on to have a number of relapses, but eventually identified a drug that's saving my life. And so when COVID hit, I wanted to shift focus towards COVID, and really excited to share more today about drug repurposing more generally, the keys to crowdsourcing communities to make sure we find the right drug for the right patient at the right time.
Thank you, David. Michelle, over to you to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Really great to be here. So yeah, Meetingabol, I'm the CEO of Meetingabol, and it's certainly changing times. At Meetingabol, we provide digital technologies for clinical trials, really kind of at the forefront of the decentralized clinical trial movement, where removing barriers of access to clinical trial participation by taking the research opportunity directly to patients in their own homes and in their daily lives. And with COVID-19, this became incredibly important, and the methodology itself really went from kind of an edge case to main case, because there were healthcare clinics and the standard healthcare infrastructure really suffered as we had to shut things down due to a risk of contagion. So over the last couple of months, our team at Meetingabol has really moved very quickly to enable the technology at a greater scale, as the need has scaled dramatically to be able to continue clinical trials that were in flight prior to COVID-19, as well as enabling these very important therapeutic and vaccine studies that have moved extremely quickly to bring new treatments for COVID-19. So I think, Dr. Feigenbaum has done phenomenal work in drug repurposing prior to COVID-19. His work today in COVID-19 is really inspiring, and our company takes it that next mile to get these therapies to be tested in humans and show that when they are safe and efficacious. So anyhow, awesome to be here today for this discussion. I'll hand it over to Josh.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Josh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here as well. Just to be clear, I'm not a doctor, but I think Ritesh didn't want me to feel left out, so I'm going to do my best here. I'm a long-time digital health guy. I'm the CEO of FigureOne. Kind of the cocktail party soundbite is that FigureOne is the Instagram for doctors, but really the more detailed explanation is that we are a medical knowledge sharing platform where HCPs of all types all over the world come to share real-world medical cases. So kind of peer-to-peer medical education. And so we'll talk a little bit about kind of what we were seeing on the COVID-19 side, but we've been seeing really unusual kinds of cases early, well before they were kind of well known, whether that's MERS or SARS. We were seeing Zika cases posted into our platform when we were only an English-based platform in Portuguese. And so obviously, we've had a similar experience here with COVID. And so I'm glad to be here. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining us. I did not want you to be left out. So I was actually going to put doctor against my name, but I know a lot of people on this webinar know me too well, so they'll call me out straight away. So at least you have deniable plausibility there. So David, over to you, I think, first, because from a drug repurposing perspective, your story was fascinating to me when we met, and I subsequently have been following you and listened to the NPR study and read all the recent materials that have been posted. Tell us a little bit about that journey and how are you applying what you went through personally for your life into this new pandemic world and COVID specifically?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I was a healthy third year medical student when out of nowhere, I just started feeling deathly ill, similar to some of the symptoms you hear about with COVID-19, fatigue, abdominal pain, fluid accumulation. And quickly I found out I had Castleman disease, this rare immune system disorder that, like COVID, the immune system gets out of control and attacks your vital organs. And so, unfortunately, I struggled for several years and really hoped that some researcher somewhere was going to find a drug that could save my life. And it was really the fourth time that I relapsed, and I realized that I couldn't just hope that someone somewhere was going to figure this out, and I would need to dive in to identifying a drug. I knew that there was no way that I would be able to conduct research to lead to identifying a new drug candidate that we could then test in me as the first human. I knew that we didn't have the time, we didn't have the resources. I knew that the best chance I had of survival was that if I could do research to understand what was happening in me, what was going wrong in me, and then look at all of the drugs that are already FDA approved and said, well, I think that this drug could actually have an effect on me based on what I'm seeing in my own cells. And so I started on a journey doing that. I was finishing up at Penn for medical school and began performing a series of experiments on my samples. And unfortunately, or maybe even fortunately, I relapsed in the midst of those studies, and I was back in the hospital and nearly died for a fifth time. But the reason I say maybe fortunately is that during that time, that meant I got a number of blood samples from myself while I was relapsing and in the time leading up to it, which meant I could perform experiments on those samples and eventually found a signal within the data that pointed to this one communication line. It's called the mTOR pathway. And mTOR is really important for immune cells to communicate with one another. And the best part about mTOR is that there's a drug that's already FDA approved that can inhibit mTOR really well called sirolimus. So I started taking it myself, kind of skipping all of the steps that are often taken in trials, began testing it on myself. And it's now been over 6.5 years that I've been in remission compared to previously I was relapsing just about every 8 to 12 months. So I'm literally alive today because of one of these repurposed drugs. But what I left out of my story that I think is really important is that it wasn't just me on my own doing this work. We assembled a team called the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network and really relied on the crowd to determine what research studies needed to be done. The experiments I was running on my samples weren't just ideas that I had, but we actually relied on the community to say what sort of studies needed to be done. And we've really scaled that for Castleman disease. And so I think when COVID hit, here I am alive thanks to a repurposed drug that treats a cytokine storm very similar to what we see in the most severe COVID patients. And Ritesh, I know you and I spoke about this before, but I found myself hoping that some researcher somewhere would follow our blueprint or they would kind of read our papers. I was like, we just published these papers on cytokine storms. I hope someone will read them and then, follow through. And then about a minute later, I said, well, wait a minute, why should I be hoping that some other researcher somewhere does it? I run a lab focused on cytokine storms. Maybe we should do something, which led us down the road of looking for drugs to repurpose for COVID-19.
At the moment, you are looking at that. I mean, there's so much going on in this world. Everybody's racing towards some sort of vaccine. We're seeing some of the public statements in the normal mainstream media, and I'm sure there's about another 20-odd folks around the world beating away at this. How are you working? Are you doing the same collaborative? Is that the same approach?
Sure. So we're really applying what we did previously, but really on a nuts and bolts basis. What we're doing is early on we saw that a number of physicians, you guys have certainly seen in the news, are trying various drugs in patients. Some of those drugs are being tried off-label, so they're approved for one thing, being tried for COVID. Other drugs are going through clinical trials with groups like Meetingabol and Michelle's team. But there's a lot of drugs being given to humans. So we said, okay, we need to create a platform where we track all of the drugs that have been reported to give to any human with COVID-19. And early on, we thought, I bet there'll be like 20 or 30 drugs. Well, Ritesh, there are over 250 different drugs that have already been given to humans with COVID-19. We hear about the same 5 drugs in the media every day, and unfortunately, not all of them have been as effective as we would hope for. But the important thing is that there are a lot of drugs being tried. So we're tracking it. It's called the Corona database. Anyone can access the data, tracking all the drugs that have been given, using insights on what has been given and what seems to be working to inform what we're doing in our lab to figure out what new drugs should be tried. Because unfortunately, of those 250 drugs, a very small fraction of them are probably going to turn out through a clinical trial with Meetingabol or with another group to be effective. And so we need to continue to boost that pipeline up. So our lab is looking for new drugs that could be more effective potentially. And so it's really, in my opinion, it's about getting a sense for what are all the drugs being used. So that way you can pick out what are the drugs that look most promising to move forward to a randomized controlled trial, because we really can't get a sense for what's working until we get to the RCTs.
Interesting. And that leads me to Michelle. So we've got Dr. David working really hard on getting these put together. You have the infrastructure. Are you seeing a change in the way trials are being done? One of the big things I noticed is huge amount of speed now. Where we used to say, oh, it'll take us 10 years to do something, we're now getting to the phase where somebody wants some answers in 6 months, 3 months, or they want a signal at least that this can be done. Is the platform enabling some of that?
Yeah, I think, you really hit on it, Ritesh, that science specifically in drug development is happening at, kind of warp speed, right? You've probably seen even the name of the project's called Warp Speed, where the goal is to dramatically accelerate clinical drug development. I think that certainly technology plays a critical role in this across a number of different domains. The preclinical work, and then also I think the drug repurposing, there's a big role for technology in identifying the matches of existing drugs to the pathways. The role that Meetingabol is playing is to accelerate that clinical drug development by in a couple of different ways. One of the things that we did was, we were seeing the timeline to study start going from somewhere, between 12 and 16 weeks, which would be a normal timeline from, when you kick it off to then have a first patient in, to 4 weeks. And so, you suddenly were contacted by a company running a vaccine trial or a therapeutic trial and saying, we want to have first patient in 4 weeks. And so, and people may not appreciate the complexity of a clinical trial, but in general, these are happening in multiple countries. You're deploying a technology that doctors and patients are using simultaneously. On the patient side, it's translated into the native language, and where you're gathering really important information across critical assessments and compiling all that data. So we set out a program called Access, and this was essentially a pre-configured vaccine platform where we could begin to get kind of trial ready patients who would be using the mobile application and be qualifying and stating interest for clinical trials. This technology platform then can dovetail and adapt to the specific requirements of a given vaccine or therapeutic trial, so that the patient who's already using an application, has entered critical data, has expressed interest in research, can dynamically enter a trial that they have been specifically matched to based on the data that we have captured. And, efforts like these have really enabled us to do those 4-week startup timelines. But I think, the industry is moving very, very quickly. I think that I'm extremely inspired by the collaboration that I've seen, and by just, the willingness to try things that really we haven't tried before, at least at the scale to which they're being adopted. So I think it's a really, necessity is not only the mother of invention, it's also the mother of adoption, apparently. And a lot of us who've been pushing for these digital technologies are now seeing that the work we are doing is having new relevance. And one quick plug, if you probably see this in David's background, but if you haven't, let me see how I can get this in here. David's book is amazing. Racing My Cure is one of the best books I've ever read. And I think he's, has highlighted his work in repurposing, but I think COVID only highlights the importance of that work. And it's so important for all different diseases and conditions. So if you have a chance to read David's book, I have to give it a plug as a physician and person who works in life sciences and healthcare providers. Just one of the best books out there. So anyhow, side note.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Sure thing, David.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And I agree, the book is amazing. I'm halfway through it, David, because, you know, my days are too long. So I go through about 6 pages and fall asleep, but it's really good. And it's a great personal story as well there. So, you know, Josh, over to you. I think most importantly, you know, you and I met, I think, on your second day at FigureOne. I call you guys the OGs of crowdsourcing in healthcare. How has the platform shifted? Has there been a huge upsurge in content sharing and cases around COVID? And what are you seeing on the platform itself?
Yeah. So it's interesting. You know, we started to see some early signal and some interesting cases way back in January. We have some interesting folks, and we're not really allowed in certain countries. There's no FigureOne in China, in Iran, in Egypt, and we have people that use VPNs to kind of get around this. And we started to get messages and some interesting kind of information starting in January from people that claim that they were in Wuhan. Now, I don't know if that's true. We then started to see cases coming in from Europe, and especially early on from Spain and other places where people were saying, look, this is what we're seeing. Two things are happening. One is they're posting cases and kind of saying, has anybody else seen something like this? Is this COVID? Is this something else? These are x-rays, presenting symptoms. There was a lot of, as you can imagine, scrambling to figure out what was going on. The second thing we started to see was there was a lot of cases and just information being posted by providers dealing with the overwhelming number of people in the ICUs. And so we were getting really amazing testimonials, whether they were emails or videos from people who are physicians. For example, in Madrid, we had one early saying, look, we're in a country that is very developed with a great healthcare system, and we are swamped. This is a real problem here. And we started to kind of see that drift across to Europe. And then, of course, in March, we started to see a real inbound of that kind of similar type of information here in the US. We are normally a closed platform, but we took all of this stuff starting from day one and put it out, open into the world. If you just go to FigureOne.com and look for our COVID stuff, you'll see it. And we started to get overwhelmed, not just with the cases, but with other people wanting to have conversations. And people were starting to find FigureOne that didn't necessarily know who we were, tagging us in Twitter. And then I kind of took, we're a small company, we're 25 people. I took part of the team and just said, go out onto our social platforms where we have a big following and start to track down people with cases, because they're kind of being put in different places, but they may not have the same audience that we could deliver, and brought them into the app. From there, we started to see another really interesting thing, which was a lot of physicians wanted to try to find a way to answer a number of common questions that people may have. And so we started to do these kind of Q&As with different people from the Cleveland Clinic or from other kind of well-known places that were seeing a lot of interesting stuff. And so it's all out there. It's just been kind of an overwhelming amount of things. And we continue to see that kind of information come in. And that's still the case today. I mean, we still see a lot of that kind of stuff comes to the platform.
Now, presumably with that kind of capability, you know, if you look at what David is doing with the sort of looking at all of the 250 drugs, and let's even assume that 25 have some really good potential, you've got a capability of also doing a similar thing to help David put his database together, right? Probably from the FigureOne case study stuff. Is that something that may be of interest, David? I think you guys should potentially talk. It just dawned on me.
Yeah, it would be,
go on.
yeah, it would be of great interest from our end. I mean, what we really want to do, as I was mentioning earlier, is to really have a central database of all drugs that we know have been given to any human with COVID-19, mainly for two reasons. One is that, as I said earlier, that we get the most promising drugs to Michelle, her team, and others to actually move those forward into randomized controlled trials, but also so that can inform what are the other kind of other things that we can think about other than just the 250. Are there other promising leads ahead of time? I would love to have discussions around that. I want to highlight kind of a similar anecdote as to what Josh mentioned, and that's that so we started tracking these drugs back. We started on March 13th when it really started hitting the US. And we assembled a team of volunteers to actually go through and find any published case of any drug being given to a human. We now have reviewed over 20,000 studies and extracted data on about 1,300, all volunteers. It's pretty amazing. But what we found early on, similar to Josh's anecdote, is that we kept finding that corticosteroids were some of the most frequently used drugs. And what was surprising about that was that the only guidance that anyone was giving was don't use corticosteroids. The guidance wasn't use this. It was just don't use corticosteroids. That WHO said that, most governments were saying that based on previous experiences with SARS and MERS. And what we found is that it continued to be used at really high frequencies. Currently, it's one of the top 3 most frequently used class of drugs. And then about a month ago, a great study came out of the UK that demonstrated a really strong effect of corticosteroids in the most severe cases, highlighting that real world use of drugs, I mean, the fact that people were using these drugs over and over and over again, despite recommendation against their use, likely was because they were observing something that was meaningful. Now, of course, there's other confounders. Sometimes drugs can be used frequently because there's a lot of media attention around them. And I would say that wouldn't necessarily correlate likely, as well as just it seems to be working without the corresponding media attention.
Sounds like it's a parallel universe kind of situation, right? You've got the Modernas and the Pfizers of this world who are focused on new discovery, new vaccines, and going through that process, where you're sort of looking at, well, let them do that, but I'm going to look at what's working now, and can that be reused similar to your Castlemate experience, right?
That's exactly right. And can you use that information to figure out, other than the 250, is there maybe another drug or another class of drugs that we really need to bring into the mix? I mean, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. There are only somewhere around 2,700 FDA-approved compounds, maybe closer to 3,000. So we're basically 1 out of 10 FDA-approved compounds has already been given to a COVID patient with the intention of treating that patient. So this is a very different world than the Castleman's world or the rare disease world that I live in and that Michelle spends a lot of time in. And that's where it's hard to even get one drug to be, move forward to a trial, or one drug tried. You can do 10 years of research and maybe get one drug through. 250 drugs have already been tried. So that's why we need tools like Michelle's, so that we can really leverage the data.
So Michelle, is it feasible to do this as quickly? Because at the end of the day, we've been through these crises, right? We had the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, and there was a lot of this kind of conversation with multiple cocktails of medications that were tried, and then they came up with a sort of a cocktail solution, if you wish, and look where we are today. Are we seeing similar sort of things, Michelle? Are we trying to get these things out there faster?
Sure. I mean, I think you hit on something that's highly relevant, which is the fact that, the initial drug for HIV was AZT, which was a repurposed drug. So, I mean, only highlighting really the importance of thinking about what we know is safe and what's been approved as an option. And, as a physician, when you've got a sick patient and something's not working, you're going to try things that are fairly safe, and you're balancing that against the risk and how sick the patient is. So, in dermatology, we have seen repurposing play a critical role. I was a specialist in a disease called systemic sclerosis, and that had a 90% fatality rate until we discovered that sildenafil, or Viagra, could provide life-saving intervention for pulmonary hypertension in those patients. And so, I think that the repurposing is probably one of the most expeditious. It is the most expeditious approach to treatments. Now, of course, you're limited by the set of things that does exist and has been tested. In the category of getting something net new, there's a number of things that can be done to accelerate that process. First, one of the most challenging or time-consuming parts of a clinical trial is enrollment. So, right now, as an example, you can go to the NIH, you can state interest for recruitment and participation in clinical trials, which is definitely important because it's going to help us test these therapies and vaccines faster if people are ready and willing and available to enter the clinical trials. Additionally, there are a number of things that can be done in the trials from a design perspective that can accelerate the timeline so that we can understand safety and efficacy faster. Coming back to your comparator on HIV, the HIV clinical trials were around 4 years in terms of duration until we came up with a surrogate in the form of viral load. The viral load became a really good measure for the efficacy of the drug. And from that, we were able to collapse the trial timelines from 4 years to 6 months. So these efforts around digital biomarkers or early immune profiling, understanding, in a vaccine, if you've received the vaccine, you have to be exposed again and not get it to truly prove efficacy of the vaccine, right? that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of people. So there are definitely ways we can show earlier efficacy. And I think, all of these things in combination, learning from what's been done, leveraging the treatments that are existing, and using new methodologies to prove efficacy earlier are all critical paths to getting in front of this as fast as we can.
And Josh, are you seeing any situations on your platform where people are discussing drug reuse? Are they looking at, just like David was saying, we're tracking, these people are trying these different things to treat their patients? It sort of feels a lot like Dr. House, right? Did this, didn't work, let's try this. Are you seeing those kinds of cases being put on FigureOne?
Yeah, we see those. Especially in the beginning of COVID, we saw a lot of this kind of experimentation, and at least physicians willing to kind of fess up to the fact that they're doing a lot of this experimentation. We certainly see it on a lot of the rare disease cases that we have. We see a lot of that kind of thing, and those patients take a long time to be diagnosed, and a lot of it is trying to identify what the symptoms mean and then what may make sense, especially the repurposing in a lot of third world countries where there's just obviously much more access to things that treat one thing that could also be used to treat another. I think there's a couple of other things that are really useful about what we're seeing. One is that, for example, with COVID, when we start to see these cases that were affecting children, and there may have been some thought that there's some relationship to Kawasaki disease, which is not necessarily easy to find, we probably had 20 cases of Kawasaki that had been posted over the years that we could bring to bear so people could just look and see what's going on. And I think that that's really been important. And so for us, the other thing that's really valuable is, it's one thing to kind of be able to find where the different treatments are being experimented on. I also think that, as Michelle points out, it's really important to make physicians aware of when there are relevant trials for their patients in certain areas. We're hoping to be able to look at cases of any type by image or by symptoms or both, and then overlay like the trials.gov type database as a simple example to say, hey, Dr. Ritesh, you're in Cary, North Carolina. I see you've got a case. It's about this type of thing, probably. Did you know that down the road at Duke, they're enrolling for a study? The second thing that I think where we can play a really important role is just dissemination of relevant information. It's one thing to kind of see where all the experimentation is going on. It's another thing to see where there is real traction, like David's talking about, for something that just may not be well known and definitely not talked about in the media, to then be able to disseminate that broadly, especially through the lens of a case. That's really how physicians learn. And a lot of the complaints that we hear from physicians relative to drugs is that they're not well explained, the data is not well explained, and the efficacy is not necessarily well explained, so they understand why this versus that. And so we really try to help play a role there.
Yeah, I was going to highlight, may I just add one thing, Ritesh? I think Josh really hits on the importance of, how physicians think. And I think people may feel like doctors know everything, but the interesting thing is you learn a set of things you know very well, but you also you develop a gut feeling around a particular set of conditions. And, when COVID emerged, the first thing I did was track down, some of my ICU doctor colleagues and say, what does this feel like? Like, do these patients look different? Do they present differently? Like, you're really trying to get a feel for the condition and the differentiators, and they can be extremely subtle. And so I think, as a user of FigureOne and a longtime fan of the company, the physician to physician understanding and the way that information is conveyed becomes a critical asset in being able to pick up these cases earlier and really provide top care to those patients when there's a real lack of information, because you're going off of insider information. And I think the way they're distributing that worldwide is really, the importance of that is very significant.
So, by the way, guys, David and Josh, you've not been on one of our webinars, and Michelle has done exactly what we encouraged you to do, which is interrupt me so you can have a conversation with each other. But also for the panelists, for the people who are watching this, you are also welcome to, post as many of the questions as you wish and interrupt me. My job is to try and keep the train on the tracks if I can. But I've never been successful with Michelle on a webinar. So you guys are on my side, I hope. So we'll see. But going back to the conversation with Josh, how many people are on your platform now? And is it truly global? Are you sort of getting cases from India and Turkey and Nigeria and places like that?
Yeah, so we've registered now, just in the history of the company, almost 3 million HCPs. They're all kind of in and about at various times. That ranges from physicians all the way down to NPs, PAs, veterinarians, you name it. The word of mouth spread of the product is been amazing. We're in 190 countries, which is just about all of them. We will run programs, educational programs, and see kind of dots on places on a map that you just didn't know were there. We see cases from all over the world, literally. And I think that's been a real boon to what, kind of the benefit of FigureOne is that initially the app was only in English. We now have a version in Spanish and Portuguese. That was a reaction to Zika. But the universal language, for most medicine is English, but the images and the information that can be presented is a really big thing. And a lot of what we see is that, and the goal of the company really is around democratizing the knowledge such that, if any of us on this webinar got really sick today, we probably would get pretty good care. But there are many clinicians all over the world who either treat a broad population, and they are generalists, or they just don't have the same training. And so a lot of what the platform has been able to provide is kind of leveling up, if you will, information that is relevant and useful all over the world. And so we absolutely see cases from all over.
So David, it was an interesting point that both Michelle and Josh have made, which is, I think, Josh, in your case, the images are really important. You're getting copies of x-rays, I'm presuming, as cases, right? So have you seen this kind of thing happening in the lungs, that sort of stuff? Is any of that valuable to you, David, or are you just focused mainly on the drug side of things?
Yeah, it's very valuable. I mean, to be able to interpret whether a drug's working or not, and how effective it is, it's really, really hard. And I should mention in COVID, what makes it, in Castleman disease, when you do drug repurposing, there are no cases I'm aware of a patient with my disease who gets better without treatment. We will continue to get worse and we will die if we don't get treatment. That's every patient with idiopathic multicentric Castleman disease. In COVID, so what that means is if you try a drug and you do get better or you don't get worse, you can get a sense that the drug is what did that, because there's just no cases of them getting better spontaneously. In COVID, as we know, thankfully, over 90% of people will survive with no medication at all. And so as a result, that's great. I'm really happy that's the case, but that makes it really, really hard when you're trying to figure out whether a drug works or not. Because if the majority of people are just going to survive and get better without medication, then it's hard to know when one thing works or another. So the data that you mentioned that Josh has and clinical correlative data is really, really, really important when we're doing the things that we're doing to try to get a sense for what drugs seem to be working, what drugs don't seem to be working. But the bottom line, and something that I think Michelle and Josh and you, Ritesh, and hopefully a lot of others would agree with, is the bottom line is that we need to do well-designed randomized controlled trials to really know if something works or doesn't. In the meantime, when we don't have that data, we have to make decisions, as Michelle mentioned, with the information we have. We have to follow our gut. We have to do what is best for our patient. But the moment, and then at the same time, groups like mine in my lab, we need to do everything in our power to move those promising drugs towards randomized controlled trials that are done quickly, effectively, and appropriately. And then when those data come out, we needed to follow the data. We need to disseminate the data appropriately through platforms like FigureOne. But again, I guess the thing I just want to emphasize is that all of the data that we have around drugs being used worldwide, if it's not through a randomized controlled trial, what I think is most helpful about it is to figure out, is this a drug that we should move to a randomized controlled trial, as opposed to saying that, hey, I mean, we have drugs in our database that work in 26 out of 26 patients. That's really promising. Or we even have drugs that work in 1,000 out of 1,100 patients. But again, would those patients have gotten better without therapy is the real challenge.
So that leads me to one of the questions Eva May asked early on, which I think points to what you were just talking about. And I'll do it verbatim. How do you get permission/access to drugs for a crowdsourcing trial? So you're identifying the drugs. How does it get out there? And I'm presuming between you and Michelle, you should be able to answer this question. Who wants to go first?
I'll take a first stab at it, and I'd love to hear Michelle's thoughts. So this is a very unprecedented time where where I think that there's more information than ever about this disease, which also leads to misinformation. But our general approach is that when we find promising leads, we're working really close with the FDA and also Department of Health and Human Services to make sure that when we find a promising lead, we communicate it directly to the groups that we're working with in both departments. So that way they can then potentially move forward with it how they see fit. I mean, another way to do it, which we haven't done, is to contact the companies that own those products to say, this is a signal we found. We make the data freely and publicly available so that those companies can easily go through our database and say, oh, wow, my drug looks really promising. But this question of access, I think it's about education, and then it's about academic groups usually working with companies like Meetingabol to then move forward the trial. Michelle, what else would you add to that?
Yeah, I think that you really highlighted that physicians generally will refer to, the extremely kind of rapidly growing set of data. So we'll go to PubMed and we'll Google our PubMed search, what should we do in this scenario? What to look for? What are the new therapies? And I think then it's a matter of, really being able to access those. And of course, that's going to vary worldwide in terms of what drugs are available where. I think that you see that there is a lot of misinformation and a lot of hope. So the importance of the clinical trial is really to take what might be promising and then to prove whether or not there's real value. The challenge is that, as David alluded to, these are cost-intensive, time-intensive research and scientific experiments, essentially. And you can't do that for all therapies. So you have to make informed decisions about which ones you're going to move forward. And that's not necessarily an easy choice. So, the more information we have going into it, the better we can make that decision about what to move forward into those randomized control trials. But I think, we will, through drug repurposing, continue to get more promising therapies to look at in these randomized control trials. And it's going to be through, early research that's then disseminated, clinicians utilizing and furthering those case reports, creating a growing body of evidence, and then having enough kind of information to say, yes, let's take this into a clinical trial.
So that sort of really dovetails well into a question that Sandeep is asking. And I do like your idea, Sandeep, of a Snopes for COVID, a fact checker. Maybe FigureOne, Josh, there's an idea for you. You can create the Snopes of COVID, right? So we can fact check stuff. But the real question here is on the drug repurposing side, particularly for you, David, and Michelle, is there's IP, right? The pharma industry in general is so IP intensive, and crowdsourcing is the complete opposite of IP. Does drug repurposing actually help? Because you've already owned the IP. You're just showing that drug company that owns the IP, here's another way of making more money at this. Is that part of the thing that's valuable here?
Michelle, I don't know if you want to take a stab at that.
I think you hit on a couple complexities. So, in a perfect world, this data would not be so expensive and time intensive to get, and we could explore everything. I think the reality is that there is this kind of commercial infrastructure, and it does relate to the IP and the ability to commercialize those medications and then offset those development costs. So, I think that you see clinical trials around drugs that there is a big commercial opportunity, and therefore, in general, there does need to be an IP opportunity for the owner of that compound. And from a traditional drug development sense. I think that's why you do also see in parallel a lot of physician-led grassroots efforts to show efficacy where that IP may not be an option because the patents are expired or they're already in the generics. And so it's a little bit of a complex issue. And I think David and I have had a number of conversations about, with companies like Meetingabol and leaders like David, can we move compounds that don't have the IP into well-substantiated randomized control trials to generate that evidence? And I think the answer is yes. And we'll see more and more of those efforts because technology does reduce the cost, and teams like David are creating the evidence, the early body of evidence we need to know which drugs to move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say that I think Michelle and I, we're we're slow to answer that question because it's such a hard question to answer. At least I think that's why I was slow to answer it, because the challenge of IP is really one of the things that slows down drug repurposing worldwide. As I mentioned earlier, in the rare disease space that I live in, we get lucky if one drug gets tested for rare disease a decade. And so, and obviously it's very different here with what we're seeing with COVID. I do think that it's important to realize when it comes to when we think about efficacy of a drug, we want a randomized controlled trial that's well designed, it's well powered, it's got a big enough number of patients to where if there's a negative result, you can believe it. If there's a positive result, you can believe it. And I think what's important to remember is that trial doesn't have to be done by the company. The person who owns the IP for that drug does not have to do the trial. In fact, for COVID, the vast majority of studies that are going on right now, or I should say at least half of the studies that are going on right now, are being led either by government organizations or by academic institutions. And so they're often getting the drug free from the company. The company's happy to provide the drug for free, but they're not actually paying for the trial to be run. The government organization or the academic group has gotten funding from the government organization or from another philanthropic organization. So even if there's no IP, so let's say there's no likelihood anyone's going to make money off of it. If it looks promising for COVID, there's enough of government funding or philanthropic funding right now to actually fund well-designed trials. So even as the point here, no IP, you can still find an effective drug that can be used. Dexamethasone is the best example. It costs less than $1 a day for a day's dose of dexamethasone, and it reduces your mortality by 35% in the most severe patients. So we can handle it without IP in COVID, but in the non-COVID space, rare diseases, if you don't have the IP, it's so hard to get the funding to do the trials.
Ritesh, if I could just add one thing real quick,
Go for it.
So we had a few different meetings with the FDA a while back, and they were working on a project where they were essentially trying to bring to the drug makers examples where repurposing the drug was effective, just kind of in a rogue way in other parts of the world. Really just for the purpose of saying, hey, would you mind creating more, of this so we can use it in this way, or release, whatever you may have to release legally to allow us to do this, and trying to surface that through real cases to be able to bring to these people demonstratable examples where, a drug for one thing was really working well in another part of the world where they just had no idea that was even happening. And it was just kind of like down and dirty, scrappy on the ground, doctors doing this thing. So it's a real interesting thing to try to be able to bring that information to those folks to get that kind of permission.
I think, so there's a couple of interesting questions from Murali and from Jeff Waldron on the chat. For Murali, I think we've addressed your question around the IP, and it is a complex thing, as both David and Michelle have put together. And you can look at the optics of some of these things. Look at the announcement today from Moderna, and there's a lot of folks in the public saying, wait a minute, you're going to charge me $15 a dose for something my tax dollars have paid for you to discover. So I think it's a very complex mire that you could get into around the IP and everything else. So hopefully, Murali, we've answered your question. Jeff's got an interesting one around what is the, where did it go again? He had a really cool one and now I've lost it. How does repurposing of drugs address the patent expiration? There are, as you, David, were alluding to, there are certain ones that have expired, right? Or Michelle, I think it was you, that, they're generic and you can test it. Do you think those companies would then go, wait a minute, it's my drug, I need to get paid, or the government's funding to do it?
So for drugs where the patent is already expired, even if you find a new compelling use for it, unfortunately, you can't get back that patent life if it's now expired. However, I think that that's a great idea, and Jeff makes a great point. I think we need to get creative, particularly for the rare diseases, and thinking about maybe where you could do that, where if a drug's generic and that company discovers that maybe there was a new use that no one had thought about before, that they could actually, gain back some patent life. And I think that there could be a lot of anger from generic companies if they're already producing the product, but maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe there's some solution there, because without that, the company who initially made the drug, they're just no longer interested in looking into new ways that the drug could work.
Mm-hmm. And there you go, Sandeep. I think we've answered your question around your disclosure. And, he said, what happens if the repurposed drug is so old that potentially the generic manufacturer or novel med maker is only interested in making highly visible and more dollar-driven products, right? But I think that's part of what we're talking about here. So, I think, David, in the database that you have, of the 250, do you think there are potentials of maybe 20 or 30 of those being able to then get out there into the trial world and we start seeing some movement in this area?
Yeah, the good news is that a very large number, I should know the exact number, but a large proportion of the 250 drugs that have been given to humans already and reported out, a large number of them are actually already undergoing trials. Unfortunately, many of these trials are what are called open label trials. And so open labels are really hard to interpret because you just give a group of people the drug and then you don't have a comparator group. You say you compare them to historical controls. Right now with COVID, every day doctors are getting better and better at treating COVID. So your historical controls that might have been the cases you treated a month ago, if you treated those same patients today without the drug, they maybe would do better just because the doctors are getting better at things like proning them on ventilators or giving them the right anticoagulants. So I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge when they're open label. I understand the reason people do open label. They want to know, is it worth me investing the money in doing a really solid RCT? I'm a big proponent of saying, yes, just go right to RCT. Please don't do open label trials because they're so hard to interpret. I mean, I feel like I've got whiplash from all of the newspaper articles and press releases about this drug is curing this number of people, but they don't have randomly assigned control groups that didn't get the drug. And so I think it's really, really critical that you and I'm going to keep harping on it, getting to the RCTs. And unfortunately, some RCTs are underway.
And Michelle, gosh, we met 6 years ago, I think, when you sent me an email randomly. You're on a hiring tear. Does that mean a lot more people are engaging on platforms and looking at distributed trials and virtual trials and speeding up things? Is that like becoming the norm?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for a lot of the reasons that David has highlighted, you've got drugs that had existed that people are testing. You have a whole pipeline of new therapies. And then, unfortunately, I think we're going to see a third set of drugs or kind of therapeutic indications, which are COVID sequelae, such as the cognitive, the cerebrovascular effects, and others. And so there's definitely a lot of focus right now in life sciences and in clinical development. Our company, is one that is taking those trials outside of the clinical site and bringing them directly to patients in their everyday lives. I think we're playing an important role in companies like ours that really open the door to access to a much broader and more diverse set of participants, play a really important role because, as you've seen, our entire lives have been disrupted. We know that people are not going to the hospital for routine care. We know that people obviously are quarantining. They're not doing the things that they do on a daily basis we were doing beforehand. So to bring this research directly to patients, people, participants in their homes is really important right now. And certainly we're one of several companies who are facilitating those efforts.
Josh, from your perspective, cohorts appearing, are you seeing pockets of innovations going on that seem promising on your platform, people sort of sharing some successes in particular parts of the world that could be applied in others? And how is FigureOne using that data? Do you see other ways of using that content data that you're sort of, gathering on your platform?
Yeah, I think we do see some pockets of information that is worth sharing. I think that it's interesting to kind of see the type of information that people are sharing, and then kind of the group kind of coming in and trying to figure out what's valuable and what's not. I think for us, there's a few different roles to play, as we talked about. There's the initial kind of discovery of interesting folks that may be relevant, and really much more effective for us, I think, on the education kind of information sharing side. I think for us long term, what we constantly hear from the pharma companies for our purposes is that the physicians are kind of the last mile, if you will, in finding out effective ways to get patients into trials of any kind, period. Especially on rare cases where, you may only have 5,000 people walking the planet who may have something, and just having one or two relevant ones that could go in a trial are really important for us. And so, it's really a lot about how can you, what we hear essentially is that physicians with a lot of these patients essentially just kind of say, I'm out of luck, you're at the end of the line, go try to find the academic medical center that may be closest to you to see if there's something there. And it's just kind of a general lack of awareness. And so I think for us, it's about being able to try to take the information, the patients, and whatever kind of cohort information is popping up, some of which may be valid, some of which just may be off in left field, and grouping it together and getting it out to the right people. We're kind of just a bullhorn of taking all these inbound pieces of information, figuring it out, and then sending it out, versus trying to validate everything, right? Because we are, while we're a closed platform for HCPs, you have all sorts of stuff coming in from all sorts of different directions. And so when we're able to partner with the right people like Michelle or like David, we can say, hey, here's some interesting stuff. Go figure out if it's useful for you or not, and we can go get more. A lot of the other thing that we can do, and we've seen this actually, done this in a lot of rare disease, is, for example, we would put out a rare disease educational piece on how to teach doctors to go down a differential pathway, eliminate the horses and get to the zebra. And then suddenly doctors would pop up in other parts of the world where there are undiagnosed cases, or at least they believe to be, and we can connect those physicians directly with the experts to kind of dig in deeper. And so I think that there's a lot of interesting things we can do in that realm, especially as the different therapies and vaccines come out that are relevant in different places.
We've got about 6 minutes or so in the webinar. First of all, you have a fanboy in Sandeep, by the way, Josh. He gave you a massive shout out. You're not allowed to do that, Sandeep, so you're banned from all our webinars. Sorry, but apparently he's been a FigureOne fanboy for years. I thought you should know. So David, I think this all started with you. Where are we heading? You've got this journey going. What else would you like to see? We've got, a large number of people out on this webinar who are either pharma companies or are doing something in health systems or whatever. What is your ask around this? And what would you like to see going forward in the next few months or so?
Sure. My big ask, you're probably not going to be surprised, and that's that if a drug looks promising, let's put together a really well-designed randomized controlled trial that's well-powered so that if it's a negative result, we can all believe it. And if it's a positive result, I think we believe positive results no matter how well-powered it is. But we want to be able to believe negative results to say, okay, it wasn't just that the sample size was too small. So first ask is let's skip all the open label trials. Let's move right to randomized controlled trials. Let's really know whether these drugs work. So that's my ask. As far as what we're going to be doing over these next several months, right now we've got data on it's over 100,000 patients with COVID-19, and I mentioned drugs on about 260 drugs given to about 100,000 COVID-19 patients. This has been really helpful for HHS and FDA in thinking about drugs that look promising for RCTs. What we've learned that really seems to be the gap is that in addition to the drugs that are being given to humans right now, there are also labs like my own that are working on trying to find kind of the next round of drugs that should be given to humans. And unfortunately, labs like mine, we publish the paper, it goes out onto PubMed, and then we just kind of usually just wait and see, like, does some doctor somewhere pick it up and give it to a human and move forward to a trial. So what we're trying to do for COVID is to try to eliminate that sort of randomness and integrate into our one platform, into Corona, all of the drugs that look promising from high throughput drug screens, from animal model tests, from cell line tests, basically get all of the hits in here in the same database with all the drugs that are being given, in the same database with all of the trials that are currently going on. So that way groups like HHS and pharmaceutical companies can go to this free and open platform and say, this drug looks promising, this drug doesn't look promising, what should we do to move it forward to an RCT or not? And so that's where we'll be going over the next few months. And of course, delighted and thrilled for anyone who wants to partner with us. We've been doing it with just a team of people from my lab and from my foundation, kind of, just making it work. And of course, delighted when there's partners who want to work with us.
And I'm assuming you're also reaching out to potentially other labs, or you'd like to have other labs and other health systems who may be doing this and connect all of these together, right?
Absolutely. The goal is that it's all in one place. It doesn't matter where in the world you're doing laboratory testing, that it all gets into one database.
So, Michelle, you have a platform, you have apps, you've got people who have a phone that your thing sits on. is what are you sort of envisioning as part of this? I think there's probably a natural partnership here around getting this stuff out there and connecting with people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things that is really important for anyone watching and listening in to know is, David and his team have really moved the needle, and they're doing this on limited funding. So if you have a chance, I'm a big fan of David, but because I know this space very well and how extraordinary and exceptional his lab's work really is, I would say hit the link up in the thread. And if you have a chance to donate to these efforts, because they're compiling the most promising therapies that, are known to be safe and effective for other conditions for COVID. And this is a massive and very underfunded part of our strategy to treat COVID-19 as well as rare disease. So, if you have a chance to support those efforts, I'd highly encourage it. I think it's a very, very important part of our strategy. For Meetingabol, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're going to continue to move as hard and fast to determine the safety and efficacy of the therapies for COVID-19, as well as, really the hundreds, 50,000 other clinical trials that were in flight prior to the global healthcare infrastructure being impacted by this condition. So, I think we've all got a lot of work to do, but I'm excited by the idea that some of these vaccines are already showing promising data, and that we have, good interventions that are emerging, things like dexamethasone reducing the mortality fairly significantly, as well as, treatments like out of Gilead and others where you have effective intervention. So a lot of hope, a lot of promise, but we still need to really work hard to get through this. I think, a lot of work to be done.
And Josh, I think we highlighted in this conversation today, your brain has probably got 2 or 3 new ideas, knowing you as well as I do, around some of this stuff. Are you continuing the curation of COVID content and putting it out there?
Yeah, we are. So we're in the middle of also doing coming in September, a massive kind of next gen version of our platform. And so it's been a lot of focus there. It's been, I felt like with the COVID stuff, I could redirect the whole company and do nothing but COVID stuff, which is important, obviously. But I think what we're trying to do is find ways to be able to kind of have a force multiplier on top of what we have. And so I think the 2 things that we can really do is, number one, we're a canary in the coal mine. We see things very early, and to be able to have the right people to disseminate that information to, and then in the reverse, right? So whether it's rare or COVID or whatever it may be, to be able to kind of take the inbound information that is real and is important and has been through the rigor that's important, and disseminate the right information forward. I think that's really important. And we have strong reach in many parts of the world to ask very pointed requests of people for very specific things. And it's really just about getting with the right people to know what to ask at the right time. And I think that's really the benefit. And of course, we're a peer-to-peer education platform. And so anything we can do to facilitate more of that is everything that we work towards every day. That's really the goal. By the way, I'm frustrated. There's trillions of dollars going out the door, and this poor guy is grinding here by himself. I was on a call yesterday with a big company out of Washington that thinks there's going to be 1,100 trials by Q2 of next year, and just the amount of information going in every direction is really difficult. It's really challenging.
And I think David is on the right track, and if we can, well, first of all, the 3 of you should all hang together and see if there's something new you can put together. And I'm hoping the panelists who've been on this, can also contribute. The last question is for David before we leave. Sputnik. Have you had access to Sputnik? Record trial, 2,000 people, I think, and off we go. It apparently does it.
I don't know. I feel like I missed out on this. When did...
The
Russian vaccine that Vladimir Putin has given to his daughter.
We have not been tracking the Russian vaccine.
Okay, good. having personally been a guest of the Russian health system, I would be very doubtful and dubious of a claim that's been made at the moment. Anyway, with that,
think it's exactly what David said. It's about the evidence and the quality of the evidence, and we all need that.
Yeah. So Sandeep has said only 76 patients have taken it. Well, hopefully they're still alive. With that, I would like to personally thank each and every one of you for one, this webinar, two, sharing your thoughts, but amazing work that each of you and your companies are doing in this continuation of this crazy thing. Growing up, I was afraid of nuclear weapons from Russia and China. And here comes this little tiny thing that has completely devastated this planet. So for all of your hard work, I thank you most sincerely. And any last thoughts you each have? You've got 30 seconds before we end this webinar. And I'll start with you, Michelle. Ladies first.
Thank you. No, just thanks everyone for their time. And yeah, let's, get back to a normal life and it's going to be relying on this incredible research in front of us. So I think it's just very important.
Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming from Georgia where the science is not always respected. And so I would say two things: be safe wherever you may be. And, the data-driven approach is obviously the most important thing. So my best of luck to Michelle and to David to continue their good work.
Thank you. David?
And then just a thank you, Ritesh, for you organizing this, doing this, and to Josh and Michelle for being a part of it. I really enjoyed it. The last thing I would just say to the audience is that COVID-19 has been in every way negative and bad, and it's been just terrible for the world. But if we can create some positive silver linings from this, and we can do some of the things that Michelle mentioned to speed up trials moving forward for other diseases, if we can create some silver linings, speed up trials, do more drug repurposing, think more creatively about pulling together data, that's something that I'm very, very hopeful for. And I hope all of us will look for what positive things can we take out of this. Again, it's negative, but what can we create that's positive for the future?
Fantastic. And with that, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everybody who logged on to review this. There will be a recording of this. We will post again. So look for that, for sharing with your colleagues and anybody else out there. And I wish you well. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Stay at social distance. And we'll see you again. Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ritesh.